I'm very happy to see you all here and welcome you on behalf of the Freud Museum, on behalf of Monika Pessler, the director of the Freud Museum, Daniela Finzi, the head of the scientific programs here, and on my small part. And I'm very thankful that the Freud Museum agreed to invite Eyal Rozmarin. And it's a tremendous pleasure to introduce to you Eyal Rozmarin, whom I had a chance to know for quite some time now, who is a psychoanalyst and writer born in Israel-Palestine, but living and working in New York and New York upstate for many years. Eyal has published many articles in various journals on the interstices of psychoanalysis and the socio-political forces, or as he himself put it, on, I quote him, on the psychological and the socio-political, about subjects, collectives, and the forces that pull them together and then tear them apart. He's the co-editor, along with Adrian Harris, on the book series called Relational Perspectives in Psychoanalysis, and he's on the editorial board of Psychoanalytic Dialogues. Eyal teaches at the White Institute in New York and at Pink, my old home in California. And his first article has just appeared in German in the newly released book, which I have on my lap, Neudenken und Neuhandeln, der Einfluss gesellschaftlicher Umbrüche auf die Psychoanalyse, with a paper entitled Immigration und Zugehörigkeit in der Psychoanalyse. And in the room we also have Helga Klug, and Daniela Kammerer is not here, but the three of us co-edited this book. So Eyal has also a book forthcoming with the title Belonging and its Discontents. I don't think there could be a more timely paper than the one we will hear tonight. Eyal began to write this paper in the early 2023, having been interested for a long time about the different facets of belonging and unbelonging, of identity and disidentity, and of the internal and external turmoil of living as a foreigner in a strange land, now called home or homeland, having his sense of homeness and identity being split apart between the US and Israel, belonging to two different communities that provide him with different identity and attachments. I think a lot can be said about the borders encircling the English word belonging and the German word Zugehörigkeit. While the English word emphasizes the sense of longing and belonging, having much more passion inside of itself, the German word underscores the sense of hearing and being heard. I think both the pain of longing and the experience of being heard or not being heard are embedded in these two signifiers. Eyal's paper, as I said before, began in 23, but then came October 7th in 23. And this which completely changed the already difficult and complex picture Eyal had begun to draw of Israel, a country he also did not want to be claimed by. His thinking, which had taken place on a threshold, had now, he writes, turned into a fault line. Moving between different atrocities, horrors, brutalities, and injustices on both sides, Eyal takes us, as you will hear, along his many paths of extremely thoughtful and sensitive contemplations, never allowing an easy answer or solution to the various abysses both Israelis and Palestinians are facing. With Eyal's text, you will be led along thresholds, cracks and breaks, frontiers and borders on both sides of this very troubled region, never truly resting on one side only, as it is so often the case in the present-day discourses. In the current debates, you're either for or against Israel, for or against Palestine. But Eyal's paper is truly one of the very few texts that opens up a space for thinking, that allows for a real exchange and not a swap of insults, invectives, and discriminatory statements. He calls things by their names without ever being racist to either side in this conflict. My sense of Eyal's paper is that he truly seeks a truth in the best psychoanalytic way of thinking, both an unconscious and a political truth of the seemingly unsolvable conflict. But I will turn the discussion now to Eyal and let you, the audience, decide for yourself. So please welcome Eyal.
Thank you. Thank you, Jean. This is a really old friend of mine. For a few years now, binded on the investigation of the death drive, actually. For arranging this for you, for having me here. It's very special. I'm going to be talking about belonging and doing it here in Freud's old house. Freud, who was so ambivalent about Vienna but did not want to leave, because what is, I guess, for him, what is Freud without Vienna? Who is Freud without Vienna? So it feels especially kind of meaningful to do it here. Let me tell you a few things before I begin to read the paper, just for some background, for kind of personal background as well. So I was born in Israel-Palestine, as Jean said, but even to say Israel-Palestine is already a political statement, right? Because I was born in Israel, and I was raised there, and I was told stories about where we come from and what we're doing here and there, and why it's important, and why we own it, and why we belong to it, and it belongs to us. But then with time, it became clear that the stories have an agenda, that the stories are ideological, and that actually the stories we are told are erasing other stories. And I started getting interested in those other stories, which are Palestinian stories, of course. Palestinian names to places that you don't know why they have the names, and a lot of ruins everywhere. So I started becoming conscious that I'm coming from one place that's also another place. When my time came to go to the army, because every young Jewish non-Orthodox man goes to the army in Israel, I did not want to go. And there were, because I objected to the occupation, was much less horrible than it is now, but it was already pretty horrible, and I did not want to go. And there were two ways at the time not to go to the army. Either you go to where you're supposed to come and you say, I'm not willing to serve, and then you go to jail. You go to jail for 30 days, you come out, they try to send you again, you say again, I'm not going, and after a few times they let you go. But it's about 6, 9, 12 months of going back and forth to jail, and I did not want to do that. The other way is to get a medical diagnosis, or if you don't have anything wrong with you, a psychiatric diagnosis. And that's what I did. And it was a long, arduous process. I did it while already in the army because I couldn't do it before. And it was a very, very hard thing to do for me personally. At some point I was doing a psychiatric case, and at some point I really did not know. Am I just performing? Am I really? And I was 18. At some point my parents started figuring out what I'm doing. And to my increasing shock and surprise, they started putting obstacles in my way. In the beginning, trying to persuade me not to do it, but then when it became clear that I'm stubborn, I'm going to do it, to actually use all their connections, and they had a lot at the time, to stop me including at some point turning the defense minister against me. So at some point I found myself struggling myself, my little, maybe crazy, maybe not self, with my parents and the state and the army and the government and everything. I managed to do it, but something that really lodged in my mind, in my body at that time, was a question that, in a way, is the question that I've been thinking about it since. How is it possible that the people who raised you, who love you, and want everything best for you, will turn against you so violently if you're moving against the group that we all belong to? If you are not adhering to the rules, to the norms, to the ideology of the group, you find yourself your parents, you're becoming your enemies. And so that's something very, very striking that I realized at some point. It became sort of the riddle I'm still working on. So that's one introductory note. The other is more intellectual. Why I'm interested in belonging. So after I managed to get out of the army, I went to university, I studied philosophy, sociology, got more and more into social theory, and theories that try to explain why society is the way it is. There are some good ones, Marxism, Frankfurt School, the French, Foucault, Althusser, Deleuze and Guattari, the 60s, 70s, there's more, of course. But they all explain to us in very general ways, I would try to use a psychoanalytic term, that there is a social unconscious, in the sense that we are all ruled by principles, by structures, by processes that we're not aware of. If you take Marxism, for example, the idea that there's ideology that's actually making our experience as it is, but we don't know it. So there's kind of a general theories of social unconscious, if you will, but they're not psychoanalytic and they're not really thinking about what is it inside the person that makes the person, the individual, the psychological entity attach, sort of become part of that machine that then influences. And I think for this, as a person who's then studying psychology and psychoanalysis, I became interested in finishing up that or exploring that space, which is not about theories of how society works, but thinking from a psychoanalytic angle, how is it that we respond? How is it that, if Althusser talks about interpellation, the state points you, but what makes you turn? What is in us that makes us answer the call, respond to the order, accept the control, the management of social forces? And it's in that way, in a very circular way, I got to the idea of belonging, which I think is, of course, not my idea. I just picked it up. The need that we have to belong, our need to be part of groups, is something so essential that it makes us willing to do almost anything. Because if you don't belong, you can't really exist. You don't make sense for yourself. A person does not exist. A subject does not exist without being a subject of something. So anyway, that's a short, long introduction to how I got here. And what I'd like to do is to read you some of this paper. It's long, and I think I would like to have time to talk also, so I'm not going to do all of it. Jean gave you some of the origins of it. It started before October 7th. Now we have all those dates, like 9/11, October 7th, May 16th, and then continued. After, the premise is, as you will see, I have an analyst that I work with on the phone who is in Tel Aviv. I live in New York, he's in Tel Aviv. It's my third analysis. I wanted my third one to be with an Israeli Hebrew-speaking person. I wanted to go back to that part of me. I did two great analyses in New York with American-speaking, American English-speaking people, but I really wanted to do Hebrew, to do my roots somehow. And so that's what I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. My analyst lives in Tel Aviv. His house stands on the edge of a neighborhood that was built in the 1950s as a socialist utopia. Two-story buildings with small apartments placed along tree-lined alleys and gardens like an urban kibbutz. If anyone knows Tel Aviv, Ramat Aviv. It is close to where Tel Aviv University was built around the same time on the ruins of an Arab village called Sheikh Munis. The inhabitants of Sheikh Munis fled during the war that erupted when the British left Palestine. For the Jews, a successful war of national independence. For the Palestinians, a catastrophe that is still going on. They were not allowed to return, the Palestinians, that is. I was born in a similar housing project about 15 miles away. This once modest neighborhood has since become affluent. The houses expanded into compact villas, but the bucolic feel remains. The trees have grown, the gardens are lush. There are nannies strolling with babies, children playing, and parents sitting on benches, usually on the phone. On the other side of the road sits a vast government compound. It houses the public relations arm of the Israeli army, the foreign intelligence agency, the famous Mossad, and the internal security force responsible for surveying and policing the occupied Palestinian territories, called the Shabak. My analyst and I, so just have this picture, a little beautiful neighborhood with trees and babies, and my analyst's office. On the other side, it all leads to Tel Aviv University, which is a beautiful campus and a place where I studied. And on the other side is this huge, big antenna compound, gates, soldiers. My analyst and I do our work on the phone, but when I'm there, we meet in person. It is a curious thing. As I get close to his place, my American phone stops working on its own. This is because, and it took me time to understand, this is because the government agencies across the road operate under a cyber cloud of protection. Israeli phones are open to its surveillance, but foreign ones are not. And so when they breach the foreign phones, when they breach a certain radius, they are disconnected from the network. My Israeli phone continues to work as usual. This is a constant reminder of what goes on behind the tall trees on the east side of Lebanon Street. It is a center of state surveillance and violence, a place where clandestine operations are initiated and justified by an Orwellian apparatus, where people are imprisoned without legal protection and tortured. It is a massive organ of the state of exception that rules the territory between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, the heart of what many of us consider an apartheid regime. The proximity between these tree-lined alleys full of children and that biopolitical people-breaking machine, between the room where I come to lay my heart bare and the heart of so much darkness, is a condition of my analytic setup. Even more so, since we are on the phone when I'm not there mostly, my analyst often goes out during the sessions. Sometimes he walks into the park inside the government compound. The thing is, because of the intense cellular activity taking place there, the connection can be interrupted. We are meeting in the most vulnerable territory, that is psychoanalysis, but the government is present in the air between us, and its presence is literally breaking us up. At some point, I made a joke that we are probably being listened to. I imagine the listener. She's a soldier in active duty, somewhere between 18 and 20. She listens to conversations between local and foreign numbers, obviously. She was reassigned from listening to Palestinian phones, looking for conversations that could compromise people because, say, they are gay, and so make them target for blackmail and collaboration with the occupation forces. It is already close to the end of her shift when my analyst and I speak, which is afternoon in Israel. She is impatient. When we finish, so does she. She takes the bus to the city center, the same bus that I take. We must have stood right next to each other at some point. Her name is Tal. I know what she looks like. I know what her parents look like. She could be the daughter of good friends. She has a boyfriend. They go on trips together. They have sex. She's a lovely young person with big plans for the future. Sometimes we even speak to her. I wonder what you think, Tal, I might say, jokingly, of course, but it's not just funny. We really do think sometimes that we might be listened to. There were quite a few times when I wanted to tell my analysts something I knew from Israeli connections. I have friends and patients who know and do things that cannot be made public. But I didn't, or I hinted. I was afraid. It has become the case even more so since the beginning of 2023, since a new government has been trying to destroy the last traces of democracy that Israel still has, and there has been massive resistance movement. It is obvious that the security apparatus has been tapping the organizers, even as the resistance is increasing among its own members, which is not true anymore, but it was. I simply could not trust that our conversation was safe. I've been wondering whether our work suffers from our unavoidable consciousness of its setting. The geopolitical territory that is Israel-Palestine, in its soul-crushingly violent, religious nationalist present, a territory whose current state we both deplore and yet matters to us deeply. Can we create the delicate suspended space that analysis requires in the midst of so much trouble? Or to ask the question in a more general term, is reality a detriment to psychoanalysis? There is clearly a strong current that thinks that it is, that the world outside draws away from the depth we can reach if we keep looking inwards. Those who emulate the famous Bionian dictum, no memory, no desire. Some of us, however, have come to believe that the notion of a separate inside is a delusion. That when you go all the way in, you find otherness in both how Laplanche and Levinas meant it. You find that, as Lacan puts it, the unconscious is politics. When you go all the way in, you find the social, historical, ideological narratives that hold the subject in place and give him meaning. You find, in the words of the year's Oscar winner, everything, everywhere, all at once. In our case, there is signal interference, the potential of eavesdropping, and one imaginary person called Tal. There is a prosperous city in the center of a warring, borderless territory where many beautiful things are weaved into spectacular manifestations of evil. There are people in communities with their histories and ideologies, all condensed into a small, mostly arid piece of land. And reflecting them all, there are all kinds of selfhoods, of unconsciouses, and transitional spaces pertaining to this territory, these communities, these histories and ideologies. and our complex and precarious relations with them. There is a psychosocial register that is fundamental to our subjectivities and to our social relations, including our relations as patient and analyst. What's in play in this psychosocial register is our attachment to groups. Strong, ambivalent, conflicted, passionate, forced and voluntary, but always also anxious attachment to groups. The ethnic groups, the religious groups, the ideological and political and national groups that we participate in, our collective attachments, our collective identifications, the threads that combine into what we feel as our place in the world, as our very selfhoods. Or to put it in other words, what's in play is belonging. Belonging in the communities that give us our identities, belonging as perhaps the most essential aspect of being human among humans. Belonging and its discontents. I've been thinking about the relations between subjectivity and collectivity through the prism of belonging, because belonging captures their dual nature: attachment, affiliation, emotional involvement, identification, but also ownership and responsibility and rights and debts. To belong means to feel something, but also to have something, and further, to owe something to the group that allows you that feeling. Allegiance, at least, a sense of mutual responsibility, and rights, mutual responsibility, well, I lost my thing. And in more extreme situations, sacrifice. Like in risking one's life or the lives of one's children in fighting the collective's wars. Belonging is a precious and costly feeling, sometimes so costly that we cannot afford it. And yet, being without can be worse. Because belonging is identity. Belonging is the foundation of who I am. We say in love songs, "You belong to me." A parent tells you, "You are my child," and you answer back, "You are my parent." Groups and collectives claim us too. "You are mine," they tell us. "We want you." "We are yours," we answer. "We want you too." But sometimes we don't. Sometimes we work hard to escape the groups that claim us. We refuse all identifications. We transition. We lose our religion. We immigrate. We try to detach, to disidentify, to defy the many pulls of our affiliations and loyalties. We try to shed our belongings, to unbelong. And sometimes they don't want us. There are always and everywhere groups that reject or abandon or even deny our existence. Or they try to control us or change us or make us into scapegoats. And too often they declare us their enemies and try to erase us from the face of the earth. We are all in relations, haunted, uneasy relations, with the groups that define us as they hold us in balance between taking us in and driving us away. The social links that keep us in place may seem strong, but in fact, they are tenuous. And for that reason, our identities are uncertain and frail. We are all constantly locating and articulating the selves that we form vis-a-vis the matrix of our belonging and unbelonging. And this ongoing process of finding and expressing ourselves in these terms is how we know who we are, what we identify as ourselves. That sense that we each have, "This is me," is an ongoing project, a search for a focal point in a web of subjective collective fluctuations, of longing and being claimed, of attaching and being taken hold of rejecting and being ejected, of abandoning and being expelled. A web of bodies and minds that has been holding us, words and sensations, pleasures and pains, like that holding environment that Winnicott imagined. It has been so since the moment we appeared in our ancestors' imaginations. Since then, we've been dreamed up, played with, and told who we are to them. In this sense, our lives are an infinite conversation, negotiation, resistance to, and desire for all of these voices as they echo across the space where we are looking for ourselves. A transitional space, to borrow further from Winnicott, a space of persistently questionable agency, where the self itself is a transitional object, part sensed, part imagined, part owned, part given on loan by the world around, somehow me, but also driven by unconscious forces, enigmatic, uncanny, mythic, demonic, a space that is both inspiring and creepy, both exciting and scary, both enlivening and deadly. A self constructed by transpersonal, collective matrices whose foreignness draws the entire periodic table out of which its molecules are made. A transitional space, a transitional self, a transitional space self continuum where we are in a permanent search. And so I'd like us to think, contrary to the individualistic current in which we all swim, the current where psychoanalysis emerged in the minds of people who made it their destiny to overcome the constraints of their social historical origins, for the most part Jews from the periphery of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, relocated to Vienna and then escaping genocide to the UK and the Americas. I'd like us to just think about who we are, where we come from. I'd like us to think against the grain of this psychoanalysis and its investment in the premise of a singular, separating, individuating subject. I'd like us to think, parting with this heritage, about how we all strive to belong, seek attachment and affiliation, desire that feeling that communities give us when they pull us into their bosom. And for that reason, so afraid of being rejected, excommunicated, exiled, that we spend most of our life's energy making sure that we're not. And for that reason also, so tormented when we let ourselves see the forces that bind us and begin questioning our collective anchors. Most of us waver, mostly unconsciously, because to doubt one's belonging is to flirt with betrayal. The betrayal of loved ones who are bound together with us in our communities of origin, the betrayal of loyalties that have been instilled in the very grammar we use to tell our stories, and sometimes, or in some ways, the betrayal of a covenant that makes our actual lives possible. Because our communities are not only a matter of feeling, and they are not only imagined, as per Benedict Anderson, we actually do need each other to survive. Belonging is a matter of troubled attachments and identifications. The vehemence of its expression, such as in certain national or ethnic religious sentiment, is proof of the potency of what makes it difficult. The heavy burden on the self, for one, but also the inherent internal violence of societies. René Girard argued that we are always on the verge of killing each other, because, in a nutshell, we learn what we want by copying the desire of others. And so we always want what they have. For Girard, it is the figure of the scapegoat and the rituals of sacrifice that keep us together. we take our competitive murderousness out on a designated other, and having gotten rid of it temporarily, we can stay together. And of course, this Freud in Civilization, its discontents, which I'll get to later. What I would like to add to that picture is the psychosocial forces that bind us, that make it so that from the inside of ourselves and the gravitational centers of our social arrangements, most of the time, our murderousness is tucked away or sublimated. Our communities hold us not only through power and the fear of death, they hold us also through love. That complicated, self-signifying, identificatory force of belonging, that gravity that pulls us to each other, that drive that makes us seek each other. Not only one person to another, as in the kinds of desire that psychoanalysis has emphasized, but also subject to group. And these two pulls or drives, let's call them collective desire and collective violence, or the drive to belong and the destructiveness of belonging, at best, they live in tension. At worst, they annihilate the subject. My analyst and I, we are constantly expressing and testing our belonging together. We feel our affiliation through political discussions. We articulate our intimacy in the language of our shared geopolitics, especially when the news are disturbing, which they are increasingly more and more, or when we hear Tal on the phone. When I think about all the work that I've done, both as patient and as analyst, I think that the good often transpired in negotiating our ability to belong together. And the failures were always related to refusing such negotiation, and therefore assigning those tensions of belonging together to an unconscious that will never speak. We don't always need to belong together. Sometimes it's better to see that we can't. But we do need to locate our encounters in these terms. We need to explore the social, historical, political fields that we map ourselves on and bring them in contact, or we cannot find each other. And if we cannot find each other, we are destined to remain in a world of fantasy, which is always the fantasy or ideology of someone else. It might be true that beyond a certain threshold, we would not be able to stay together. Yet, as we linger on the threshold, I'm finding who I am. I realized how much I'm willing to expend in order to retain a sense of belonging, how much I need to choose to sometimes unbelong, to feel a sense of freedom, and how fundamental it is for me to understand myself this way. I think we need to realize how important this is for everyone and experiment with a notion of psychoanalysis that begins there. Now, this was up to October 7th, and now there's a whole after October 7th. I will read a little bit of it and then stop, I think, so we can actually talk. So this I wrote maybe a week, two after it's October 7th. I was trying to think on the threshold, but on October 7th, the threshold became a fault line. Lingering was no longer possible. Now we are clawing not to fall into an abyss. On October 7th, Hamas fighters entered Israel and killed 1,200 people, mostly civilians. 200 or so were taken hostage. There were massive atrocities, protracted, cruel scenes of torture and rape and murder. Israel's army failed miserably in protecting its citizens. But it then launched a counterattack that it was clear from the start would be more brutal than ever, and no one, I think, could have imagined how terrible it would get. In our first session, after the war started, my analyst and I found ourselves wondering which is better, Hiroshima or Auschwitz? Is it better if a murder is perpetrated from a distance, from the air, from a faraway control center? Is it somehow better that a murder committed at close range and slowly, facing the people you kill, flesh, blood, and terror? And is it better for the victim to have their house toppled down on their heads without warning, or to see the killer's eyes as they come for them? Of course, we are talking about the Israeli Air Force bombing Gaza. There was no ground invasion yet. Versus the Hamas killing people at close range. Pilots flying fighter jets versus on-the-ground assassins. This is the ethical calculus we are engaged in as the war begins. Absurd, perhaps, but this is what we found ourselves discussing, which is really the question of what killing we identify with, what killers we are consenting to be. War makes you deliberate such questions. Who am I wishing to see killed? How and for what purpose? All this talk about destroy the Hamas or resistance by all means, this is the underlying question. Whose life are we willing to sacrifice for our cause, which might be to exist? At a time such as this, identity is cast as a matter of bare life, as Agamben talks about it, of actual existence. And sometimes it really is. You might be killed for who you are. The Hamas assassins did not stop to inquire about people's political positions. The Israeli bombardments, neither. Who you are, and simply sometimes where you are. Dozens of the victims inside Israel on October 7th were field workers from Thailand and aid workers from the Philippines. From the point of view of collectivity, there is no subject that is not a political subject. Affiliated, identified, recruited, implicated by the political systems that control his conditions of life. The bombs and the missiles and guns are always political. But how about the bodies destroyed and the souls that inhabit them? Yes, of course, they were placed there by political constellations, which also reside with more or less conflict inside of these bodies and minds. But is there such thing as just bare human life? Before the collective identifications, before the political machinations, before the webs of belonging that cut and bind it into political subjects. And how do we, as psychoanalysts, keep the relation between the bare human and the political in mind? A West Bank settler, leader, whose son is held hostage in Gaza, is interviewed on Israeli television. He says he is willing to see his son die for the cause, which in his case is Jewish theocracy over the land promised to his people in the Bible. This is the Jewish-Israeli version of the Hamas. An opinion article written in response in the newspaper Haaretz is titled, "Your son does not belong to you. You have no right to sacrifice his life." That's the title. I hope the son survives, of course, and never speaks again to his father. I hope the father suffers the torment of being orphaned by his son. But this man is saying what many parents feel, or at least consent to, perhaps not for the sake of messianic hell, but almost always for the sake of collective survival. No Israeli parent I know of are rushing to the border these days to pull their children out of the tanks that are entering Gaza. Although I do hear about parents whose reserve-age children are abroad, begging them not to come back. This is the power of being bound together in a collective. There is a very steep price, an assumption that when a certain threshold is breached, there is total responsibility. And when we are made to believe that we are collectively threatened, many of us will consent to paying this price. It is a volcanic borderland where collective pressures melt together the political and the ethical, making a mass that has more gravity than kinship or love. Our loyalty to the collective supersedes our loyalty to our children. We are made to feel, and we do feel, that it is our moral duty to sacrifice them. The territory of Israel-Palestine is now drowning in this kind of political ethical lava. At times like this, I think that the Freudian psychoanalysis of drives, of life and destruction, of eros and thanatos, accounts for something that our more recent relational attachment frameworks miss, or perhaps deny. The levels of hate and revenge we are capable of may be explained by all sorts of abandonment. But I don't think the abandonment of loved ones, of which we are capable, itself. How do you explain a father who is willing to sacrifice his son? An attachment to myth, to ideology, to fantasy, that is stronger than one's attachments to one's own flesh and blood? And those myths themselves, how do you explain a story like Abraham and Isaac, or Samson, or Jesus, or a political agenda like the reestablishing of at all cost of a biblical Judaic temple or Quranic Muslim caliphate? At times like this, we encounter the bare fact that the power our communities exert on us can be more commanding than the adhesiveness of our love relations, that our association with collective narratives can be stronger than our attachments to our own lives. At times like such as this, the question, who I belong with, takes on the full weight of its consequences and obligations. There is an immense pressure to choose, to coagulate, to declare loyalties. But this kind of pressure works on us always. We feel it sharply when the collective neural network is triggered, when it shoots through us like the pain of a knife cutting to our common flesh, but in the subjective collective unconscious that we all inhabit. We feel its grip and fear its doxing every waking moment and in our nightmares. The charge of collective allegiances, of collective desires and rage, it is prominent in our psyche as what Freud called the superego. It is the superego, that grip of the social on our bodies and minds. And this superego knows that social life is a trade-off between freedom and safety, a trade-off that in the extreme could become lethal. We just hope and do our best so that it is someone else who bears the brunt of this paradox, that our safety requires structural violence, of which we are subjects, but could become casualties, that belonging is paradoxical, that belonging might mean to die. Maybe I'll stop here. There's more.
Well, before we open it up to questions from you, I just wanted to, I hesitated to pre-create questions for Eyal, because I think I read this paper a few times, and I just wanted you to read it, to hear your voice, and to think in the moment. But what came so powerfully across to me throughout the paper is, on one hand, the incredible fragility that exists in our wish for a sense of belonging, I mean, even, without any political conflicts, even within a family, how insecure that actually is, and how easily it can be toppled, and how easily we can have the sense of being excluded and thrown out. So I think it's an ever-present fear and force. And then at the same time, the force, the strength, the conviction of belonging, of what we do in order, as you said, and you ended with this, the absolute, almost fanatical desire to destroy the other so that we can underscore our belonging. I found that a very powerful line through your paper, as well as, which hadn't been so clear to me, your father's willingness, in a way, to sacrifice you, which then was repeated by the settler's father, who said he wanted his son to die for the cause. And I do think it's a incredibly important question, and very relevant right now too. This is another question for me, which is also what we experience right now with elections in America, of all the things that are actually, that we hold to be familiar, we're willing to sacrifice, in this case, for some really crazy and perverse leader. So I just wanted to ask you to a little bit elaborate on that tension between this immense fragility and yet at the same time this immense willingness and forcefulness to jeopardize anything to maintain a sense of belonging.
I think it's the two sides of the same coin, that because it is so necessary and so precarious, we're willing to do almost anything. I think we don't know who we are without those matrices, without me being Jewish, Israeli, man, etc., etc. There are some, very basic categories, and yet they define us so intimately that it's almost impossible to move away. It takes a lot of work to try to disentangle from it, because I think there's a lot of social pressure, and because we don't know who we are without it. I think I didn't emphasize it here enough. I do it later. That belonging has, it's part is about why we need it. Another is what's so scary about not having it, and the other is that there's belonging is so much an issue of loyalty. There's so much. It's always described as loyalty, especially when you get to big groups like nations and religions and ethnicities, and that to move away really feels like you're a traitor, and it's a feeling that's very hard to deal with. And because we're so vulnerable there, that's where society sits in us and actually gives us our identity, and why I think we're willing to do so much. I think the part that I would add now is that there's a lot of passion in belonging. When you think about, it's not only that it's hard not to belong, and it's scary and painful, and that we want to be held in a sort of a collective bosom, and then we feel good. I think, and Elias Canetti talks about it, for example, or other people, that think about the energy of the mob, of when people get together. But it's not just the mob. Think about my poor, horrible country, or the energy that comes together and to push, that people gather together and move forward. That there's some gravity, some passionate gravity that we also need to understand, why people group together and storm, expand, war.
You alluded to that in a little bit. You said that the resistance movement in Israel has changed a great deal from shortly after October 7th, you know, Israelis storming, having huge gatherings and protesting Netanyahu and
Before.
yeah, and before and at the beginning also, you know, really being wanting the hostages to be released, and this has wavered off, right? As you alluded to.
Yes, in Israel
That
specifically,
resistance has yeah.
Something happened there that is very striking. Is that when before October 7th, the society was really breaking up to, let's say, the democracy willing people and the autocratic religious group. And some people say that it was the beginning of a civil war, civil conflict among the Jewish population of Israel. And then what happened is that Hamas attacked, and everybody forgot that they had disagreements, or forgot it in practice. And everybody who said, we're not going to serve in the army when this is the priority, just ran to the airplanes and started bombing. And it was very chilling. And so part of it is the attack. And it was very immense trauma. The permeability of the border, the way that it could be Palestinian fighters could get in and do and did really horrible things. But then I don't think we really so there is the threat and the coagulating of but I don't really understand what's going on. The levels of destructions are unjustified by any military cause. It keeps going. And it's revenge, I don't know how to, but there's something to be understood there. But I think, and it's going to be difficult and maybe triggering for some people, but being an Israeli now, I begin to understand what it was like being a German during the Nazi. Because I understand how it is that you object really deeply, you can object deeply to what's going on and feel completely helpless and not know what to do and just keep on with your life. You know, we ask, how could it happen? This, how it happened. There's something going on. I'm not saying it's exactly the same, but there's some collective movement, and you lose yourself in it. You don't know what to do. You just do what you're supposed to do. You even go on an airplane and bomb more because you're told, even though I don't know what happens to people's consciousness, but we're looking at it now, I think. Which is not a...
Yes, Dari.
Should I just speak up? Hello? Okay, fine. Well, thank you very much for your essay. And I would like to take up this issue of the passion you just addressed, yeah? Because I was thinking about what Jan Wolf Bernstein was saying at the beginning, comparing longing with Zugehörigkeit in German, and saying that, you know, longing has a connotation of passion, which Zugehörigkeit doesn't have. But I don't agree, because there's the word Hörigkeit in Zugehörigkeit. And Hörigkeit implies a sexualized servitude, a kind of sexualized sense of terror, yeah? Where one gives up one's will and one sense of being able to resist someone else. And this I found very interesting because I felt that your essay was developing in a way that I found to be increasingly gripping, because initially you had these categories of holding and transitional space, yeah, which are very important and might help us understand some of the anxiety involved in losing belonging. But I felt that, you know, while the essay was developing, the idea of sacrifice really became central, yeah? It really became sort of the organizing idea, yeah? And in some sense, you just can't help thinking about the myth of Abraham and Isaac. Yeah. But what I felt, and then finally you brought it. What was missing at the beginning was the idea of an asymmetry, because belonging to each other. Yeah. You can think of endless identifications between people, right? But this is all symmetrical. While I think what Freud was trying to do in, Massenpsychologie and Ich-Analysis, or group psychology and the analysis of an ego, and then, of course, in Civilization and Discontents, was to think about the asymmetry. Yeah, the figure to whom one sacrifices. This is the son. Yeah, and that is God, or the leader, in Freud's case, the Führer, right? So I really think that this is a central category without which we can't get at it. Yeah, that it's not just about reciprocal relationships between individuals that are in some sense at that same level, but there is always this idea of someone to whom one sacrifices. Yeah, and the relationship to this other is one of Hörigkeit. Yeah, of a kind of sexualized servitude or sexualized terror. Yeah, well, that's my idea. Thank you very much.
It's interesting to think about it as sexualized.
What is an English word for hörig?
Subservience, I think that you were saying.
It has a very strong sexual connotation.
Yeah.
Kind of submission, like in
Yeah.
S&M.
Ich bin dir hörig, so
Yeah.
I'm subservient to. What else is there? It's not quite it.
Being like a slave.
And obedient. Yeah.
Submissive.
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess we can think about the passionate, pleasurable, sexual, perhaps erotic aspects of being part of being in this collective orgy.
Well, it is a little bit what you were describing at the end. It is sort of you give up. I mean, initially you had a voice and you were protesting and you were against, the judicial reforms Netanyahu was invoking. And then there was this attack, and then something took over. And then I think this sort of sense of, okay, I'll do what this, what this person up there tells me to do. I'm losing sort of my own subjective individual will and just do it for, even if I'm not for it, do it in subservience to this, you might call it superego, or to this big other, and lose my own thinking. Something, as you said, something takes over. So Massenpsychologie is certainly in the mix of it.
But for me, the striking thing, and the thing that I keep, is that, okay, we're all the time running along social algorithms that are how our identities are made, how we interact, what the norms are, what's the, if you go, you listen to people like Foucault, and so our subjectivities are structured along our social worlds. And an argument has been made, for example, that our very notion of subjectivity, as it is now in at the edge of modern times, is very related to the notion of the nation state. There's a territory that's very well fenced in. You're busy with what's inside and what's outside. Inside is supposed to be homogeneous somehow, and outside is totally different. And the entire selfhood is a patrolling of the borders all the time, without much interest in what's inside, but just a sense of I am me and you are you. Mm. So that subjectivity is almost structured like a state, like the nation state, and maybe in other times will be different. Definitely in the Middle Ages, people did not conceive of themselves, or in ancient times, the same way. Or I wonder if you could even say they had the same psychology, or the same kind of unconscious, or the same kind of, because the context is inherent. But something happens, so most of the time there's something routine, and most of the time you don't have the dilemma of, am I going to send my son to die or not? Most of the time you don't have to do that. Although in Israel, for example, the children go to the army anyway. And when my father did not think, I don't think my father thought I was going to die, like that settler whose son was in captivity and who said, I'm willing for him to die. I don't think my father would say, I want him to die, or I'm willing for him to die. Just it was routine enough, so it wasn't considered. But then all of a sudden there are situations like now, for example, where the collective process takes over, and people, it's like the Manchurian candidate, something gets triggered, and all of a sudden people just do what they're supposed to be doing. And I think we don't really understand it, unless we think about the fragility of it and how much this kind of unconscious threat and desire and is being unsettled.
Stirred
And
up,
at the same time, somebody tells us, go there,
yeah,
that something different happens.
yeah.
And it could look like pleasure too. That's interesting. It could look like excitement. It is excitement.
One thing I would like to add, and I would like to question, I don't, of course, the idea of the nation state is central, yeah, but I'm not sure whether it really can carry the burden of the explanation. And I'll give you an example. There's a long literature in psychiatry about homelessness, homesickness, yeah, and it's actually was considered to be a lethal form of depression. And this literature culminates, around 1915, 16, I think, when Jaspers wrote his dissertation called Heimweh und Verbrechen. And he writes about young girls growing up in Switzerland, yeah, in some village, and they change the village. They just move from one village to another to become maids, yeah, or to take over the kids, take care of the kids. And they end up killing the kids. So, it was about 10 case studies or so, yeah. They end up killing the kids, and the only explanation they can give is, Heimweh, I'm homesick. Yeah? And Jaspers doesn't go much further. That's the problem with descriptive psychiatry. But the idea that there's something very violent about the idea of the Heim, of the homeland. Yeah? And that doesn't necessarily require such a complex setup as a nation state. Yeah? So I think that even at a very local level, yeah, these forces are at work. Yeah? And I'm not denying that it then gets intensified immensely with all the apparatuses that you were describing here.
Well, you were talking about that in a later part of the paper, how even with all the atrocities and all the injustices you see and all the discomfort you experience, you can completely disown yourself from being Israeli.
Right.
And I would think that was the same true in Germany. On a much smaller scale, I had that same experience. I left that country. I didn't want to be here. But I could never disuse myself from the feeling of, being German, especially being considered German by the Americans. I opened my mouth and they knew exactly,
Yeah.
So it's you can't run away from it as much as you want to sort of, I think, disidentify with it. And it is an original. Also your choice to in your third analysis, to want to speak in your own language, trying to want to find something again that you had, you didn't have to, but that you had willingly given up.
Yeah, I really wanted. And you can imagine what it looks like these days. So politically, we're kind of in the same place, more or less. But he's there, and I'm not.
Your analyst.
Yes, he's there.
Yes.
And he's more rooted than I am. Obviously, he's there, and I'm for many, many years not. And so we spent whole sessions discussing how many people died in Gaza and what should we do that. It's really, and it sounds like it's not but it's the most analysis we can do now.
And being overheard all the time.
Yeah, well, now I don't even know what's happening.
By the imaginary figure. Yes. by a rather sexy imaginary figure called
Yes,
Eyal,
it's
right?
pretty cute, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, Alexei and
Hi, I also maybe have a question that also touches on the notion of asymmetry, and in particular, I guess I was struck by, I mean, not only by, let's say, the question of the prevalence of sacrifice, but also, as Jean mentioned with the example that where the sacrifice becomes like a figure of ambivalence, where there's a sort of, the ambivalence is whether you're being sacrificed as being excluded, or the sacrifices is for the purposes of inclusion. And I guess the question is that when one in, I guess the question that I have is whether belonging is sufficient to account for, let's say, the dimension of politics, which when it appears, it actually would differentiate precisely the sense of these two moments of sacrifice. You know, that in other words, there's a fundamental difference between an inclusion that's requisite for the maintenance, you know, of an identity that requires then a fundamental form of exclusion, or for that matter, let's say the form of sacrifice that might be requisite for the defense, we could say, of an identity, which of course then itself can be politically divided. So then obviously the positionality of the colonizer and the necessity of preserving, let's say, the identity of the colonialized position versus, let's say, that of the colonized. So that this dimension of belonging, which seems to be is another element which structures the entirety, let's say, of the context of, as to begin with the hyphen, Israel-Palestine, that in other words, the structure from the outset is a colonial structure which is divided asymmetrically between a colonizer and a colonized. So in particular, I was sort of thinking, just because, I mean, it's on my mind recently, but in particular, a figure that didn't appear but is also important would be somebody like Frantz Fanon, who's dealing primarily, of course, with the psychology of the colonized. But there, the emphasis ends up being precisely around the asymmetry in the sense of belonging, where the position of the colonized foundationally is deprived from the outset of precisely this relation. I mean, this is the strength of, let's say, Fanon's position, which is a radical one. So I guess I'm wondering there at that point, like how, I mean, I guess, I don't know, in some ways it's a very large question, but the issue is about like how it is that like belonging itself seems to be, has to be included within a political, you know, context from the outset that would structure the situation, you know, along these lines in which there is some like a fundamental cut that in some sense is unbridgeable, you know, so that, you know, which I think with Fanon in particular, he's dealing as a clinician with subjects where he himself, of course, cannot, you know, recommend a kind of psychic integration, an ecological integration, because that would be precisely an integration to a colonial situation, which is creating their inferiority neurosis. So there, then, of course, he can't recommend a militant political solution, even though he thinks that this is, in fact, ultimately the only thing that can transform the entirety of the context. So it ends up becoming like a fundamental problem. I don't know. I guess it's less of a question and more of a comment, but.
yeah, I wanted to ask you, what is the question?
I heard
No,
a few questions
okay.
already. I heard a few
Maybe
questions.
we can turn it around.
Let-
No,
let-
I think the gentleman next to you, Alexei, had also a question.
Alexia put it much more.
Wait, I don't know if I can.
Maybe we can have another version of it?
I mean, my question was kind of maybe touching on something similar, something that I was thinking about during your talk. Is this working at all?
Yes, it
Yes,
is.
yes, we
Okay.
hear you well.
Which is somehow the connection of belonging and exclusion. And I mean, in your talk, you kind of on the margins, you touched on some kind of Palestinian existence, but it's obviously something that is absent here. One question that I have to myself and maybe to this kind of imaginary collective of this audience is, why does it need to be absent, and in what way does it reassure us in our belonging to this group or whatever, to this idea that we have of being here. Yeah,
Okay.
something like that.
I want to start answering because there's a lot
Yeah.
of questions, and I'll just tell.
And then Amanda afterwards.
Okay. So first of all, I feel I can talk about myself. I do not want to describe to you what it's like, the Palestinian sense of belonging. I'm not equipped to do that. It would be extremely presumptuous of me to do. So I'm dealing with myself at the same, in my whatever, my collective, I don't know, but whatever it is designated. The same, I have a gender assigned at birth, I have a collectivity assigned at birth. It's the same, that I'm stuck with it. I can transition, maybe I can, maybe that's partly what I'm trying to do, but so I do not feel that I can insert the struggles of Palestinian sense of belonging and conflicts into my self-examination. I do it. I actually have an ongoing, I will refer all you to that. I have an ongoing correspondence that's being published in a magazine called Room with a Palestinian colleague, in which we write letters to each other, and it keeps, so I talk about me, he talks about him, and so that's, I do that, I try to do that, but when I'm examining myself, I'm examining myself, but I try to do it, or I think I'm doing it, from the position of recognizing that my sense of belonging, or at least how it was conveyed to me and inserted to me, comes at a very, very increasingly dear expense of other people, Palestinians. Now, I think I love Fanon, but I think the situation in Israel-Palestine, it is not really covered by Fanonian theory very well. Not that it's not a colonizing entity coming in and trying to colonize, but that the indigenous people never lost the sense of self. And they have not, as far as I'm familiar, did not develop this false consciousness, as Dubois talked about it in or Fanon, or the people of negritude. Palestinians do not have, they managed to keep their sense of self. So they are not, politically, militarily, economically, of course, there's an incredible, insane imbalance. But I think in a sense of collective identity, there is collective identity of Palestinians, which is not, or, Fanon was someone from Trinidad who came to Algeria, and he understood what it's like to be a descendant of slaves in a French colony, then came to Algeria. I mean, there's many factors there. I think in that sense, the Jews in Palestine and the Palestinians are locked in a kind of similar situation that is not a colonial situation in the sense of there is a physical, political colonization, but I don't think the minds are colonized the same way. And I think Palestinians have a very good sense of collective identity and their own identity, and they don't need me to explain that. And I think, in a way, if there is any way for us there to get out of if there is any way left to get out of what's going on, is by everyone relaxing a little bit their collective identity and agreeing to forge new kinds of collectivity, where I'm not drawn by my Jewish, Zionist, Holocaust history, however, and they are not completely organized by their own disaster, which is also huge. I think our only way is to someone say, okay, I come from this and I come from this, but we have to unless the solution is for the Jews to leave, which I don't think is going to happen, then we have to form a new collective. We have to form new conditions of collectivity there. It's not going to be like the French leaving Algeria, because the Jews don't have anywhere to go, actually. There's no France to go back to. The whole situation is there because there was Zionism since the end of the 19th century, but the big drive to the creation of a nation state there was because there were 1 million Jewish refugees in Europe after World War II, and nobody wanted to repatriate them. They couldn't go back to Poland or Russia. The United States did not want to take them. So they said, okay, let's shove them in there and let the Arabs deal with them. That's why we have a problem now. So it's not exactly the same.
Amanda.
Thanks. In many ways, you've already responded to the question that I was going to ask, but I'll ask it anyway. And maybe I'm asking it because I didn't follow you in a moment where you said we're going to sort of leave aside the sort of psychoanalysis of the individual and kind of really move to thinking the group. It just occurred to me that there's, you spent a lot of time talking about your own analysis and not so much time talking about how this situation is showing up in your work as an analyst and as a clinician. And so I guess, to my mind, the whole term belonging and this thinking of groups is precisely what psychoanalysis is meant to sort of unhinge us from. In a certain way, like going into analysis, I mean, it can be many things, but one thing that it certainly is showing that the way one has understood oneself one's whole life maybe needs to be undone in some important ways. And so I guess I'm just thinking, it's hard for me to figure out where the notion of belonging sort of stops being a good thing and really is that precisely what we're fighting in a sort of psychoanalytic orientation. So it's, I mean, not to oversimplify the question, but to say that it has something to do with, isn't belonging precisely the problem that Freud sort of sees and can, and build psychoanalysis as a cure for? I mean, isn't it the symptom, in other words? That's it.
I think that's the big question, right? It's for us. That one of my most favorite papers of Freud is from 1915, Thoughts for the Times on War and Death. That's in English, and it's I think it's many things happening there, but one of them is that he is disillusioned. He says, he talks to the audience, if it's the audience and not him. We thought and we that, but he said, we thought that the world we're moving towards enlightenment and we're all citizens of the world and we're going from the Louvre in Paris to Bolzano to this and we're sampling whatever we want and everything is so cosmopolitan. And then came World War I. And he was sitting, trying to figure out, beginning to try to figure out what I think led all the way to Beyond the Pleasure Principle and Civilization. I think that's where that whole idea of the death drive also, we thought everything was okay. We thought we're gradually liberating ourselves from those tribal dynamics where it doesn't make sense. Why should the French fight the Germans? It's two great civilizations. Why would the Russians fight the Austrians? And yet, all of a sudden, almost by mistake, because somebody killed somebody in Zagreb it was? Sarajevo. A whole process gets started, and within a month or so, Europe is in the worst war ever. So what's going on? So I think Freud struggled himself with this idea of that psychoanalysis is a practice of enlightenment, where if you just have enough insight, we will be freed from all those dark forces, and insight and awareness is enough to thinking, well, no, it's not happening. And I think that's what led him in the end to the idea of the death drive, the idea that we have built in destructiveness, desire for annihilation, or just pull toward. He has many versions of the death drive. And I think what Freud did with the death drive is try to understand, why are we not just enlightened? Why are we just not moved by our minds? What are the forces that keep pulling us back into tribes, into killing, into destruction, and so on? So I think what I'm trying to do is to follow that line where I'm trying to understand what's going on, why is it like this, and recognize perhaps that this is how we are. And we are tied to groups, and those ties are very, very strong. And in my own biography as a person who worked hard to not be in the army and then left Israel and is very, very critical of Israel and blah, 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 still feel attached somehow to something that doesn't even exist anymore. If it ever existed, whatever story I was, internalized unconsciously, it doesn't exist even anymore. So there is, I think, just to go to a whole other thing, there's a huge melancholic process going on where I think it's true for all of us, but especially when you belong to a decaying entity, the melancholia, the holding to something that doesn't exist anymore at the cost of your life. I think this is what's happening in Israel now, that they're fighting like crazy against all reason, because it's a melancholic process also, insisting to keep something that is gone.
Hanging on perhaps to an illusion. When you say hanging on to an illusion that there is this one unified country, which you say is no longer.
No, I don't think it's
But
there.
the other thing, and I know I'll come, the other thing that you made me think of when you were describing sort of the luscious life before World War I, when there was so much, one would say today, diversity, I do think, and I think we've seen this also now with the American election, when there's too much diversity, too much possibilities, and with Trump, I would say too much, maybe also sexual diversity, there's this pullback to simplicity, to very strict, rigid categories, and I think a similar thing is going. I think I see the death drive more as not so much this inner destructiveness, but this pulling back to, simplifying categories because Eros has become too diverse.
Eros has become too diverse.
Yeah, too many different attachments. Two different, and so it's that that if you think of that sense of belonging, it's just you have to pull something back to simple, clear categories. Even, which is the thing that drives me crazy right now about Trump, even if it's against your own interest. That there's so many voters who voted for him. Besides mass psychology idea, against their own interests, I think for the greater desire of simplifying the ideology, that they want to regain. In this very, he's appealed so much to the American people and voters by making the frame a very simple one. Make America white again, make America male again, and make America great again, whatever. That is after there's been such sexual diversity in America, so many different immigrant groups, that I think his sort of idea of throwing them all out, allowing no more educational budget, no more operations for transgender children. It's sort of, I do think it's a way of it's a version of the death drive.
I think, just one more thing. I think, and also the whole thing is unapologetic.
Unapologetic.
And that's, I think, was so huge for people, so attractive, because he says, I can do this, and I'm not going to apologize. There's no problem with this. People, I think, really long
No shame.
to this, and no apologies,
Yeah.
no superego.
Loic.
You mentioned the notion of sacrifice in the second part of your essay. I guess my question is every sacrifice or is every belonging created equal in the sense that it relates to the challenges of reality, I would say, in the same way? So, or to put it in a different way, is there something like a just war, or is there something like a rational sacrifice? I'm thinking about, for example, the Ukrainian invasion, the Russian invasion in Ukraine. So the one side would probably say, Putin's propaganda or Putin's worldview, that he will willingly sacrifice the sons of Russia, as he would probably also frame it the way, in order to, I don't know, restore the glory of the Russian Empire. And Ukrainian parents would probably say, it is tough, it is painful that some of us will have to go to war, but this we deem as a society necessary to survive as a Ukrainian society. So I guess my question is really like, where does the framework Eros, death drive, come into place when it comes to belonging and sacrifice? Can there be something like a sacrifice that is an expression of Eros and not of the death drive, as you mentioned with the example of Trump? I hope I made myself.
No, it's I think it's a very good question. Yeah.
I need to.
Is it maybe? Is it that the sacrifice? When is a sacrifice justified? Is that in a way what you're?
I mean, I'm thinking of it like in the Hobbesian framework.
Yes.
The trade-off you mentioned also is the one of safety and freedom. And
Right.
I think that's very interesting and very central to the whole question. But so to say, in the Hobbesian framework, you would always have the equation: it is justified to be suppressed because not being suppressed and being extremely free, absolutely free in the state of nature would be horror. Like you would not be suppressed and you would be free, but it would be horror, the horror of total war from Hobbes. So I'm thinking about, is it on the same ontological level, so to say, to ask as a society by laws that Ukrainian men should go into the recruitment office, as it is to, I don't know, justify...
Yeah, I get you. The thing that confused me is, and I still don't know how to compute it exactly, is that you said, is there a just war? But then also assigned it to Eros. And I think there could be a just war. And yes, what I wish for is for everybody to not do that, and then everything will be great, right? No Russians, no Ukrainians, no Jews, no, everybody. If everybody just keeps their children, I think everybody will be fine. But I mean, I'm being really simplistic. But for me, as a Jewish Israeli, there's always the question, apropos just war, where do you start the story? So yes, there was a horrible attack on October 7th, but nothing started on October 7th. You have 2 million people locked in Gaza since 2006 with unbearable conditions. So when you attack, is it just to attack, and then it's just to defend yourself? And when the justification goes to the question of history and historical truth, right? And I think if somebody comes to you, you will hopefully defend yourself without even asking this question, because so there's instinct too. We want to live. How this pertains to Eros and not to the death drive, I'm not sure. I don't know how to put together an ethical and a Eros Thanatos ontological world together. I don't know how to do that, but it's a good question.
There is none, probably, in Crete, in war.
No, no.
That's, I know, this is constructing something, kaputt machen.
To destroy, yeah. We have very,
I'm an architect, I'm not I can say something like this.
probably one more question, and then we have to slowly wrap up. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for your very moving paper, and also for your testimonial that apparently you discuss a lot of politics in your analysis. So that makes me feel less weird, because especially since October 7th, I've been discussing a lot of politics with my therapist, which feels weird sometimes and very unanalytic. I'm not a orthodox or not a traditional analyst, or actually analyst in training. I'm a Kahutian, so a self-psychologist.
So is my analyst, by the way. So is my analyst.
Ekahushi.
So maybe I even know him because I belong to an intervision group together with Israeli colleagues. And self-psychologists are very skeptical about drive psychology. We recognize it, but we don't believe in it. But we still do believe in the unconscious. And I was just thinking about how you could also, very superficially, understand the conflict of what's going on in Israel, and also the protests from a more self-psychological point of view. And Code put a lot of emphasis on empathy. And
On what?
empathy.
On empathy, yeah.
And also in psychoanalytic treatment, also as a key to understanding the other. And also even before October 7th, when there were manifestations against the government, and also I participated in some of these manifestations already years ago, and the group actually, the groups pointing at the occupations were always very, was always very small, and I think it's becoming even smaller now. And for many Israelis, these are traitors. And I had this, and even now the group, when people gather and demonstrate against the government, the elephant in the room is almost, it's only addressed by a very small group of people. And which, for the future makes me very pessimistic if, there are less and less people willing to face this or recognize this, that there is also collective other suffering because of the domestic politics of another group. And I feel very desperate, to be honest.
I want to say two things. One is about talking about politics in the room. Okay, so being in this particular position of being an Israeli in New York, I have a good chunk of my practice which other Israelis who want to see an Israeli, want to do the work in Hebrew. So I live daily with heartbroken Israelis who are trying to who are having conversations with their friends back in Israel, with their families, with non-Israeli friends in New York, and who are both at least the people that I see, or most of them, are horrified and alienated by what's going on with Israel. I'm never going back there. I don't want to. Really, and at the same time, having to deal with sort of the simplified American left narrative that doesn't give us a place quite. The same way that if you're Palestinian, you say, but I don't support the Hamas, and now if you're Israeli, you have to say, but I don't this and that. So we all have to explain ourselves and apologize all the time, and it's a matter of course to talk about what goes on in Israel, what goes on in America, about conversations about what goes on. That's the material. That's what people are busy with now. That's the element of self that they are trying to figure out, who to be, where to be, and it's another perspective into how what's going on now, where in the language that I use, the belonging, sense of belonging is becoming more and more ambivalent and conflicted and fraying and tortured, how deeply, deeply psychological that is. That it's not separate, it's the same thing. A person's sense of self, a person's knowing who they are. If your country is becoming a monster and you don't feel you can belong in it anymore, you don't know who you are and you feel out of place and out of self. It's annihilating. So for me, it's essential. This is a conversation. These are the conversations. It's not something else. It's that. About Israel, I can tell you that my and a lot of the people around me, the experience is just deep grief. I was angry for a long time, and I'm still very angry, but there's also a creeping sense of grief because of what you're describing, because there is no consciousness emerging. It is on the margin. There are some publications that are telling the truth, but the collective mind, including the media, the TV, is not just not telling people what's going on, and people don't know and don't want to know it. They don't know what they're doing as a collective. For me, what happened today with the court in The Hague putting out, I don't know if people know, but the court, the International Court of Justice in The Hague, took out warrants of arrest against Netanyahu and Gallant, who is the defendant. I think it's great. I think the only way we could perhaps get out of it is a lot of international intervention, not with money and weapons like the US is doing, but weapons embargo. Really, it needs to be broken down at this point, because the consciousness of the peoples, mostly the Jewish people in Palestine, I think the Palestinians are much more ready to talk, to compromise, to understand that the craziness is on our side, unfortunately, and it has to be addressed somehow on a world level, because by itself, it's really burning itself up. So I'm actually with you very, very pessimistic.
So in the end, you need another third. You need an external third.
But there isn't. That's the thing.
Yeah, there isn't, but that's what you're saying. You can't. The third that they were listening to inside is what led to the destruction. So the way I hear it, a little bit in Lacanian terms, is you need a third now, an international court, not an Israeli court, an international court that puts enormous pressure, tangible pressure on Israel for maybe things to change. And one last thing I want to tell you is it's becoming so obvious to me that how impossible it is to not have politics be part of an analytic treatment. When I was formed as an analyst, I don't want to tell you how long ago, but this was purely seen as as an acting out. If I allowed to engage in a political discussion with a patient, I think that has really fundamentally changed. I think with texts by you, texts by Francisco Gonzalez here, texts that we have also in other upcoming book with Daniela Finzi about the essay on group psychology and the formation of the ego, is how the social has to be part of the individual, and that is the two can no longer be separated out.
Yeah.
But this is not this is a minority still in psychoanalysis that thinks that way. So the individual in some way still reigns within the psychoanalytic field. But anyway, I do think we need to stop, unfortunately. Thank you very, very much for coming.
My pleasure. Thank you
And
for having me.
I hope it's not the last time you're coming.
I hope so too.
And thank you, the audience,
Thank you everyone
for your questions and for being here. It was very good. Thank you.
Thank you.